Dear guests, dear BCCP fellows, dear BCCP friends, good afternoon and a very warm welcome to this first BCCP virtual mini conference on the future of artificial intelligence for policy making. So as many others, we are responding to the COVID-19 pandemic and decided this year to actively use the potential of digitization and moved our successful annual conference online in order to keep BCCP fellows and friends all around the world connected in a time when physical contact and travels are still unfeasible. So we had to change a bit the original program and the traditional format of our flagship BCCP event, but we are sure that this new format will have a very similar impact. So the focus of our panel discussion today is on the role artificial intelligence and machine learning can play for policymaking. AI has begun to permeate many aspects of our lives, and indeed many successful companies have built their entire business model around it, creating truly enormous value for society. On the other hand, policymakers and governments are slower, but they also are increasingly using algorithmic tools, for example, in law enforcement and making decisions about the allocation of resources and social benefits, or as we have seen all over the world in the past weeks, to help combating a pandemic like the COVID-19 through tracking and tracing apps. So AI has this enormous potential to increase the quality and the efficiency of many goods and services, be they offered by private entities or governments, but its use also entails severe legal, ethical, and consumer protection challenges that need a very careful assessment. And exactly these trade-offs and challenges are the topics that we want to discuss today with our very, very distinguished panelists. So I believe that our annual conference this year in its virtual mini format is again the best example of what the Berlin Center for Consumer Policy aspires to be, a lively platform that brings together a diverse group of the smartest experts, academics from different fields and policymakers, all with great knowledge on extremely important and very policy relevant topics. So before I conclude, let me make two very short final remarks. First of all, we are quite active on Twitter and we set up a hashtag for the conference, which is hashtag BCCPConf. So please, those of you who use Twitter and tweet, use it today. And second, as every year, I am the one who is giving the welcome address, but I always really need to give credit to other people, and this year is especially Pauline Appel, and also the fantastic team that supports us. Pauline really never gave up until the very last week, trying to connect with the participants and the organization is also working well. So now we have different channels to solve on time the technical problems. But everybody in the team made a great effort. So let me say thank you very much to the BCCP team for the incredible work. Thank you very much to the panelists who accepted to be with us today. And thank you very much to the audience from all over the world. So now time to begin. I truly hope you will enjoy the conference and the lively debates sparked by our distinguished panelists. And I give the word to Hannes Ulrich, who will moderate the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. And thanks to the Berlin Center for Consumer Policies for putting this event together. Tommaso, could you unmute yourself? I'm sorry.
Sorry.
AI has made it to the center stage in policy discussions. Many academic fields have turned their attention to understanding and developing AI applications and citizens are beginning to increasingly encounter these in their daily lives. New breakthroughs and potential uses to tackle existing challenges are advertised at a rapid pace, but skepticism regarding many unresolved fundamental and practical issues have also intensified. So today's very distinguished panel will hopefully shed some light on definitions, applications, policy problems, and legal and institutional challenges. In doing so, we hope it'll spur the transparent discussions we need to pursue to harness a potentially very highly beneficial technology without stalling in the tracks to misunderstandings or an unbalanced influence of varying political and economic interests. So let me introduce the speakers, who are very grateful and happy to have. I will introduce them in the order that they will give their introductory statements. So our first speaker is Anna Christmann. She's been a member of parliament in Germany for the Greens since 3 years. She's the acting chairwoman. She's the chairwoman of the German Parliamentary Study Commission on Artificial Intelligence, and I hope she'll have some things to say about that. She's the Green Party's spokesperson for innovation and technology, and she has served on several parliamentary committees, such as on education, research, and technology, and the assessment, and the digital agenda, a German policy initiative. Our second speaker will be Daniel Björkegren. He's an assistant professor of economics at Brown University in the United States. Right now, he's spending his last day as a visiting scholar at Microsoft Research, New England and Boston. He received his PhD in economics from Harvard University under the supervision of recent Nobel Prize winner Michael Kramer. So that will show also a bit Daniel's background in development economics. He has co-founded an initiative, Precision Agriculture for Development, that has its aim to empower farmers in developing countries using the latest available technologies and research methods. He's also affiliated with several initiatives that work to promote the social impacts of development economics and data science, such as the Brown University Data Science Initiative and the Gallup Capital Social Impact Lab at Stanford University. His main research has been on digital credits, and I think there'll be lots of similarities we'll see to other applications we might discuss today, and potential unintended consequences of transparency regulations and the challenges in designing machine learning methods to achieve certain objectives. Now, the list of accomplishments of the final two speakers is extremely long, but I'll try to give a little bit of an idea. So Joanna Bryson is a professor of ethics and technology at the Hertie School of Governance. She's also still an associate professor in the Department of Computer Science at the University of Bath in the UK. She's a PhD computer scientist by training, and has thought extensively about the attribution of human traits, emotions, or intentions to non-human entities such as AI. And she's become an international authority in AI ethics and policy, I think, based a lot on this. She's published a long list of research articles and books on intelligence. More generally, she's frequently advertised governments and institutions on the topic. She's been the member of the Advanced Technology External Advisory Council at Google. It seems like she's having keynote appearances at a daily rate on AI ethics. So we're very happy to have you here. Our final speaker will be Cass Sunstein. He's the Robert Walmsley University professor at Harvard Law School. He's among the most prominent legal scholars in the United States, specializing in the fields of constitutional law, administrative law, environmental law. I think many of us know him as an expert on law and behavioral economics. And in these fields, he's published hundreds of articles and dozens of books. In 2018, he received the Holberg Prize from the Norwegian government, sometimes described as the Nobel Prize for Law and the Humanities. During the Obama administration, he was administrator of the White House Office for Information and Regulatory Affairs. He served on the President's Review Board on Intelligence and Communications Technologies, on the Pentagon's Defense Innovation Board, and among many other governmental advisory roles, he serves as an advisor to the Behavioral Insights team in the UK, who are very active in effective policy initiatives. So, sorry for taking some of your time. I'm very happy to have our first speaker, Anna Christmann.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be part of this panel with so many experts. So I can only provide a political perspective on the issue. And yeah, as you said, I'm a member of the Enquete Commission on Artificial Intelligence in the German Bundestag, which started its work, has started in 2018. So we have almost 2 years now. We've been working on AI from a political perspective in the Bundestag. And so why is it important from a political perspective to work on AI? I mean, this is an important question to ask because in the end, AI is just a technology, and we can do good things with AI and we can do bad things with AI. And nonetheless, the Bundestag decided it's such an important topic to have this kind of commission, which is a special commission because it exists to one part of politicians, like half of the commission are members of the Bundestag, and the other half is from academia, from companies, from economics, and also from civil society organizations. So it's quite a mix of expertise that we find in this commission. And I think it's so important and so good that we have this commission because AI is a game changer in many things, and it will impact many things in our lives and in our society. And I think our task as a politician is to make sure that it will change our lives to the good and not to the bad. So and that is so simple, but it's not very easy to ensure it in case of AI, I'd say. Because we have, of course, on the one hand, things like autonomous lethal weapons that are possible to invent with AI. But on the other hand, we have the possibility to make, for example, windcraft more efficient, or to use it for other things that might be helpful, especially in health. Maybe we could make care for elderly people easier. And we could easier find new medicine, maybe also a vaccine for COVID that we are looking for now. So there are also many good ways to use AI. And to ensure to use the applications we want to have, I think we first need to be the ones who develop the technology. And that is not so simple, because now Europe is not the biggest place for the development of AI. I mean, we have lots of expertise here, of course. Some of them are here in the panel today. But compared to like the US or to China, there is not going so much in Europe when we look to these areas of the world. And now they are trying to set the rules for AI a little bit. So we are dependent on applications that come from there. And I think that's not a good thing. We should have something like AI made in Europe, where we have AI that is based on our values and our goals for the society. So that would be my first point, that we need AI made in Europe, and that means, of course, for politics, that we need to fund science, and that we need to start ecosystems where applications of AI are developed that we want to have in Europe, and that we also set some legal rules that ensure, for example, that AI isn't used for discrimination, isn't used for in areas that we think are too sensible to have them decided by a machine. It leads me to the second point. So what are these rules, and what are the benefits we might have from AI? So I think the rules we need are, as I said, we need AI that is kind of fair, transparent, and non-discriminatory. And we all know the examples, for example, from Amazon, where they had a system that only selected men to be employed at Amazon because the system found it's a good idea, looking at the history of the firm. And of course, this is the kind of discrimination we don't want to have with AI concepts. And it's also the idea of using AI for like something like a social control system, which we know also from the social scoring in China in a very far-reaching way, but which also could use for these kinds of applications in companies here. So there we have to agree where do we want to have AI systems and where don't. And I think one big point is when it comes to decisions over individuals, like in such systems in companies or in the law system, where we have examples where AI is used to make rulings. These are all very critical applications where we have to be very sensible about, and where also some questions are where we want to use it at all. And then on the other hand, I think there are many fields where AI is very helpful, and that is especially when it comes to be more efficient, when it comes to ecological questions, to save resources. These are things that AI can do very well, I think, and where it's not the health system, which I mentioned before. I think it's very good to have it in image recognition to identify cancer and these things. So where it really is better than humans in the specific area to detect these things. There, I think we could do more, especially with the idea of a green AI. As I'm from the Green Party, it's not so surprising. We could invest more in Europe, I'd say, to get the benefits from AI without the risks. That is what I would say is the aim when it comes to AI, and the question what political questions are relevant for this. And maybe just one last sentence, to get all these benefits, I think there's also a huge task in education of the society in Germany, but also in Europe and everywhere else probably. People learn what AI is and what it is not, because we have many people who still think of the Terminator when it comes to AI. And I think this kind of general AI that can that is better than human intelligence in all perspective, that is not very realistic now and in a few years. And I think we have to educate people that AI is a tool, a technical tool that can be far-reaching in its implications, but still it's not the humanoid robot that will rule the world, and that these are not the questions we have to answer, but that there are many others about privacy, transparency, fairness that we have to address. So let's discuss the right questions, I would say. So this would be my first statement, and I'm looking forward for the discussion. Thank you.
Great. So thank you so much for that, Anna. So I think my main point is that this is really still the early days for AI. And you can think of the types of applications that we're starting to see happening in 3 phases. And in the first phase, there may be tasks that humans are doing at the moment. So like radiologists are looking at medical images, or loan officers are deciding whether to grant loans. And in some cases, you may see AI taking over some of these decision-making roles. But then as AI or machine learning technologies can start to make decisions in settings like that, often these new technologies are cheaper. And so it may be possible to make decisions in places where it wasn't cost effective to do so before in the same domain. So if you look at Facebook, for example, Facebook is doing content moderation over billions of pieces of content, which wouldn't have been possible without tools like this. Or in a domain that I've done a lot of work on, in digital credit, there are about 2 billion people around the world who don't have bank accounts, don't have credit scores. And as a result, it's really not feasible for loans or for banks to give them loans. Often people might request very small loans on the order of $5 or $50, and it's just not feasible for a human to make that decision. But with increasing use of machine learning and digital trace data, it actually may become feasible. And you can see there's actually a lot of use of digital credit lending in especially sub-Saharan Africa. And so there's that second category of application. And I think those two, we can start to predict how things might play out. But there's a third category that is a bit more nebulous, and it's still very new and could reshape things more dramatically. And that is a lot of these new systems provide more nuance in the detection of behavior, as well as more nuance in the actions that can be taken based on that behavior. And so if you can use patterns in how a person uses their cell phone or other digital platforms to make a loan decision, then you may be able to make other decisions as well. And as Anna mentioned, one of these things could be a social credit scoring system like we're seeing in China, where you have a system that detects very nuanced features of your behavior and then may take actions that try to encourage some types of behavior that are perceived as desirable from the system's perspective and not others. And so that is one particular application that probably was not possible at scale with human decisions, and it's kind of new, and it also reshapes the role of government. But there's many others that you could imagine, or like sub pieces of that still have to be fleshed out. And I think so some of the questions we're seeing around these systems are in those kind of first two buckets of like, are humans biased, or are these machine learning systems biased? But when we get to this third category, there's a whole bunch of other questions that we need to unravel. And it's very hard to inspect these systems or think about the societal consequences or how a government should be involved. And so I think there are two big decisions that we should be thinking of. One is, if we fast forward to this end game where a lot of these new applications are available and could potentially be implemented, what do we need in that end game? And that might require some kind of science fiction thinking and some kind of looking at trends and imagining where things will be in the future. But then also acknowledging that we may need guardrails during the transition path. So some of these technologies can be destabilizing even before we've reached kind of the full potential of them. And so that also raises a concern that if we're too quick to jump on particular regulations to look at particular harms that we're seeing today, some of those regulations may actually exacerbate problems that come in the end game. So I think we need to both look at what's happening and what trajectory we're on, as also imagining like, how is this going to play out in the future? And I think to get there, I think civil society needs to be very attuned to what's going on, have information about these applications, like what information is being used, what decisions are being made, so that we can decide when we need to investigate more, as well as a degree of foresight where we're anticipating where this is going to go. And if we implement a rule about, say, data sharing, for example, how might that play out as this progresses further? So those are my basic comments to start, but looking forward to the other comments from the other panelists.
Thank you very much, Daniel. So the next speaker up is Joanna.
Hi. Okay. Well, yeah, that was an interesting couple of leads coming in. So great. I haven't been on a panel with any of the speakers before, so I look forward to the debate part. I want to start out very quickly. We were asked to sort of say what we mean by AI, and I use a very, very broad definition that I was taught actually at Chicago in the 80s and in Edinburgh in the 90s. Intelligence is just when the conversion of what you see now into some kind of action. So it's taking context and then generating action. Okay, very simple. Yes, it doesn't require learning, or at least not necessarily an individual agent. I would still call it AI. Why would I use such a general definition? Well, I don't have a long time to go into that, but the main reason that I like it is, first of all, it's more than a century old. You don't have to debate a lot. And secondly, it makes the point that we have intelligence everywhere. We have artificial intelligence everywhere. It's not that, like we're just starting to have regulations about something that in fact is ubiquitous. And so one of the ways by which people sometimes try to disrupt regulation is by saying, oh, like it's not really AI unless we have these extra features. And so what I actually normally talk about in the context of regulation is software. Who cares if it's AI or not? Realize that software is just a manufactured artifact. like anything else. And so there's still the same kinds of obligations on the manufacturer for proving that they've done due diligence and that if their system goes wrong, that they did everything that they were legally obliged to do to try to head that off. And so you need to be able to document if something goes wrong with an AI system, is it the fault of the people that developed it, or is it the fault of the owner or of the operator, or maybe it is sort of an act of God. In this case, we are the God, right? We're the creators. But nevertheless, maybe it was something unforeseeable, but hopefully we get on top of those and get around them. So since we can do that, since every single artifact by definition is made by people, we can document the process by which we made it. So that what we care about is the human decisions behind what we produce, how we produced it, how we check that it's okay, what those guardrails are that we built. We need to be able to document all those things because the whole point of how we keep alive, how we persist, where our culture comes from, how we are able to have babies and they aren't eaten by wolves or something, is that we hold each other accountable for our actions. So that's how we've been able to construct this incredibly complicated society, which now includes the cyber, of course. So so one of my main concerns is that when people go too fanciful when they describe AI, that they lose track of that. And one of the things that was mentioned already, I think twice, once obliquely, is this idea of artificial general intelligence, that if you make something more and more intelligent in some Lamarckian sense, it automatically turns into being like a human and wanting to dominate the world or something like that. The interesting thing about where the conversations on AGI go is that they wind up turning into naive political science or naive economics, because in fact, the problems are the same. Yes, we have technology that's enhanced our capacities, and I absolutely love, I will go there, that's my third concern. But to this point about knowing things about humans that we never knew before, absolutely that totally disrupts our society. But at the same time, it is still humans at the core. We're the motive force, we're the ones building the artifacts, and it's not something radically going to change out of that. So yeah, my primary concern normally is about making sure that we hold the corporations making these technologies to account, and we keep the system well regulated, as it is not currently in America, but it is a bit better in Europe. And then my secondary concern is these economic and social impacts. So in general, technologies that reduce the cost of distance seem to increase inequality, at least till such a point that we figure out a new means of redistribution. And when you have very high levels of inequality, there's a correlation, which I have a paper in arXiv that helps to come up with a causal explanation, but we'll skip that because it's only an arXiv. I have a preprint. But anyway, what's known, and has been known for a long time, is that it's highly correlated between high inequality and high political polarization. And basically what we think is going on is that when you see scarce, so inequality creates scarce resources sometimes, depending. Germany actually has high inequality, but not too scarce of resources. And I'm too much of a digression. My point is that it's the side effects, the macroeconomics are one of the second thing that I most worry about, and trying to convince corporations as well as individuals and governments that it's in all of our interests to get back on top of the redistribution. And it is now easier to spot wealth and harder to spot income than it used to be. So let's do wealth taxes and let's do digital. It's not really digital, it's transnational is the problem. All right, and then finally, the third and final thing I was going to mention before, but I'm really glad this is a fun thing to talk about, and Daniel brought it up. There's a huge issue with human identity. Yes, we now are going to know just a lot more, right, about ourselves than we've ever known before, about each other, and different agencies have that information. And the GDPR is like a first step. I wouldn't be surprised if 150 years from now, we look back at this period and refer to it as a war, because people are using the fact that they can take the data about citizens to move their behavior around enough that, again, in high polarized situations, you tend to have these very close elections, and you can actually change political outcomes. And so the assault on some of the regulatory infrastructure and all kinds of infrastructure are being stripped away. Environmental controls, all these things, health infrastructure being stripped away in the UK and the United States. You know, basic things like that. These are part of where we are right now in this digital era. but there will also be the deeply personal thing of knowing. It's not only that knowing more about yourself, it's also that the changes in skills. So AI is sort of a prosthetic intelligence, so everyone can. I was afraid you were telling me to go faster. So it's prosthetic intelligence, so it may lower the barriers to getting into new trades, which is great in some ways, but also means that we lose wage differentiation. And so it's just a massive a level of change, but it's not quite as much change as some people lead us to believe. Without the apes, a lot of the motivations, all of our ethics, our morality, our aesthetics, all of that is about apes trying to coordinate themselves and keep on top of the wolves and the lions and the other apes and the droughts and those kinds of things. And so it doesn't make sense to think that there'll be machines that will run that will replace us and will somehow care about what we care about or care about anything else. It would just break. Life is the most robust thing we have. So when we're thinking about AGI or those kinds of futures, I hope what we're thinking about is how do we change and what is it like to be a person when you're under so much surveillance? Or can we somehow protect and defend most people from the awareness of the potential for surveillance by having sufficiently robust governments that, just like with our private property, which is largely protected, our personal data and who we are is also protected by our governance structures.
Thank you very much, Joanna. I didn't want to interrupt you. You were doing very well in time. So Cass is the next speaker. The floor is yours.
Okay, great. So I'm going to emphasize two simple points. The first is that properly regulated and designed, AI can be a unprecedentedly powerful instrument for the protection of human rights. And the second is what's needed is a Bill of Rights for regulation of artificial intelligence. So these cut in somewhat different directions. And improbably, I'm going to go after the first point, that is the uses of AI for the protection of human rights and human dignity through the lens of behavioral science. So we're going to start with some behavioral science, and then we're going to go to AI. There's been a lot of work in the last decades on biases. So human beings are biased, both in the sense that they are biased sometimes on the basis of race and sex and other characteristics, and in the sense that they fall prey to cognitive biases. For example, human beings often assess risks by seeing what risks are cognitively available, which can lead to overestimation and underestimation. And they are typically unrealistically overconfident. That is to say, they suffer from or benefit from optimistic overconfidence, which can lead them to mistakes. Now, the new idea in behavioral science is that human beings are not just biased, they are noisy. That is, their judgments scatter around the target. A biased agent will be typically to the south left, the southeast maybe of a target. A noisy agent will be all around the target. So the two human errors are bias and noise. And we've paid a lot of attention to bias, much less to noise, which is typically larger. Doctors are noisy. Politicians, with apologies to the one on the line, are noisy, not in the sense that their voice is loud, but in the sense that their judgments are all around the target. Lawyers are noisy. Administrators are noisy. Nurses are noisy. Personnel evaluations are noisy. Olympic judges are noisy. That's to say both that there's noise in the system where one doctor will say it's cancer and another will say it isn't cancer. One administrator will say this person is disabled, gets benefits. Another similarly situated will say, no, this person isn't disabled, doesn't get benefits. And noise is additive to bias. Noise is often inaudible and invisible, and it is a causal route for rights violations in the form of Kafkaesque unequal treatment that is often unobserved. What's needed are noise audits by which noise is uncovered, and wherever there is judgment, there is noise, and more of it than we expect. For example, I could give, you know, a large number. I'm going to just pick one. And it involves bail determinations in New York. It turns out the judges give bail if they think that a criminal defendant doesn't pose a flight risk. And flight risk is highly correlated with crime. So you can see this as a proxy for whether people will commit crimes. It's statistically very close proxy. And if the bail example doesn't move you, think of any number of things where we could have algorithms or instead human beings. It turns out that in artificial intelligence and machine learning, producing a very simple mechanism is much better than human judges in the sense that you could keep the same number of people in prison in New York and produce thousands of fewer crimes if you use the algorithm rather than human beings, or you could have the same number of crimes and have thousands of fewer people in jail. So whatever you want to maximize, artificial intelligence will do much better than judges. We're talking about real human beings here, either who are in prison when they ought not to be because the judge denied them bail, or real human beings who are subject to violent crime often, who ought not to be because if the algorithm were used, those people would be in jail. Now, why it's important to ask, is the algorithm so much better in a rights protective sense than human beings? There are two reasons. One is the algorithm's less biased, not on the basis of race, but it pays less attention than the judges to the most recent offense. That's a form of availability bias. It's a cognitive bias. The algorithm says, look, if you did something bad yesterday, but your whole life is good, go home. You're not a flight risk. The algorithm also says if what you did yesterday wasn't so bad, but your record is dotted with terribleness, you're going to be denied bail. The judge is tempted to say you're going to get bail. But the more important point is that the algorithm is less noisy. Judges disagree with themselves in the sense that Judge A on a Thursday will be very different from Judge A on a Monday. That's intrapersonal noise. Algorithms aren't noisy in that sense. Also, judges disagree with one another. They are scattered around the target. An algorithm, artificial intelligence, by definition in this context, just isn't noisy. There's no noise. Bias and noise, and this is counterintuitive, are additive to error. And the algorithm in this context is noise-free and less biased. If you're thinking about race, good, we can, along the margin of imprisoning people of color, do basically whatever we want by tweaking the algorithm. Some of the tweaks, which will get fewer proportion of people of color in jail, will do nothing to increase the crime rate. Others would. And we can be completely transparent about how we want the algorithm to look in order to maximize what we care about. That's unprecedented transparency. Okay, the last point I just made suggests basically the last point I'm going to make, which is that whether we want to do something with respect to sex equality or race equality or privacy is doable through a Bill of Rights for algorithm regulation. And we badly need that. A good foundation are the first words of the German Constitution, which highlight human dignity, which is violated by unequal treatment. There's a lot of lessons here for policy from the avenue of behavioral science pointing to bias and noise. The implication is that it's possible to save a lot of money and also to save a lot of lives and increase fundamental fairness in the process through aggressive uses of artificial intelligence.
I'm unmuted. Thank you very much, Cass. Thank you very much to all the speakers. So I do have one question. I don't know if any of the four of you have a fast reaction. Otherwise, I would maybe give the ball back to Anna.
I would have an answer, a question to the last presentation.
Okay.
To this noise idea. I mean, think it sounded like it would be only a positive thing that algorithms don't have any noise. But I'd say it can also be a problematic issue because it assumes that all decisions are black and white, like it's only a yes or a no would be right. But there are many, many cases where there is a lot of gray, where you can decide one or the other way. And then I'd say noise in human decisions is quite a good thing, because then as an individual, I have a chance to get different decisions from different people, and like I have a chance to get a second chance by another one when one is not very nice to me. While an algorithm would decide all the same every time I will be under this decision. So I'd say noise in human decisions can be a positive thing compared with absolutely no noise in algorithms, because there is not always or often not this one right decision, right? So that would be my question to Dan.
It's a deep question, and I'm going to give a non-deep answer. So noise is defined as unjustified variability. So I probably wasn't clear enough about that, but that's the definition: unwanted or unjustified variability. So it couldn't be good by definition. If it's the case that you have an algorithm that is crude, in the sense that it doesn't take account of particulars that matter, then we'd say the noiselessness of the algorithm wouldn't be something that would justify the use of a crude algorithm. We might say a crude algorithm that says, for example, everyone who's over a certain age can't go out without a mask. That might be a dumb idea. And we might want to see, is the person who's over, let's say, 70 healthy? And that's to say, we might want to say a crude algorithm is worse than a noisy but more attuned human being. The noise wouldn't be a good thing, but it would be the price we pay for greater attunement. And the long-term remedy, I think, you're not going to love this. From the music of your question, I'm sure you're not going to love this, is to have algorithms that are more attuned to particulars than crude algorithms. And if we get an algorithm that really attuned to particulars, then their noiselessness would be a virtue. I have a feeling the music of what you're saying is Portia in The Merchant of Venice. Says the quality of person is not strained, and argues for individualized treatment. And of course, that's true, that will outperform algorithms if algorithms aren't giving individualized treatments. But for doctors, a study of a very serious condition showed that the algorithm made the correct diagnosis 92% of the time. The doctors made the correct diagnosis 80% of the time. That's a study from 1971. The current ones, the disparities are much bigger, and the correct diagnosis saves lives. So that's a circumstance, medical diagnosis, where the noise of the doctors is not rescued by individual attunement of the doctors.
So I think Joanna wanted to give some additional remarks to that.
Yeah, so I'm going to come in somewhere between where Anna and Cass is, and I'm sorry to challenge a fellow professor about some of these things. My favorite definition of noise is signal you haven't met yet. So normally we don't call it noise if it is biased towards the worse or the better solution. It really is something that's something we decompose. And I think I agree with Cass in the case where we're able to really agree what the correct solution is, and then we can hone in on that. So sometimes with medical, there was this last thing you said reminded me of, there was a thing that Jeff Hinton said about 5 years ago, that we don't need to ever train another radiologist because we already have enough, because we're so much better at doing it with deep learning. And the fact is, there's actually more radiologists now, at least in Norway. I just happened to be asked to speak at a Norwegian radiologist meeting. there's more radiologists now because they're better. And so they create more value. So it is, again, it isn't technology versus the person. But when you do choose one thing, when you eliminate the variation of the judges and you go down to a single algorithm, then you have a single point of attack for things like corruption. So, and we have seen things where, you know, in fact, when we go out and look at algorithms in the wild, yes, a lot of them, of course, they don't make the news. They're making things much better. And we all spell better now than we used to. We all have better grammar. And, you know, there's a million ways that we are using AI to improve our lives and to be able to get to the interesting parts of our lives. But there have also definitely been cases where people have gone out and put in an algorithmic way of doing things for the specific purpose of, for example, saving money, and then making that trade-off in a particular direction that disadvantaged some members of our society. And so with transparency, and I agree on this point, so I love this point with Cass made about the transparency. With transparency, if we can be sure that there was a good process followed and that it was just and fair by the humans, then yes, we can basically write down what we wanted to be and sort of force ourselves to be what we wanted to be. One of my colleagues, Will Lowe, used the Odysseus, binding himself so he can listen to the sirens. You know, we can use AI to try to force ourselves to be the people we want to be in our societies. But on the other hand, when we don't know the right answer yet, when there's really difficult solutions, sometimes it is good to have that noise. It's explore versus exploit in machine learning sense, right? So some of that noise may turn out to be very important in some contexts.
Yes, Daniel.
And yeah, I'll jump on that as well. And I probably come in a similar space as Joanna on this. Yeah, I think a lot of these questions and the ability of machine learning to make decisions that are good depend on what our definition of good is. And typically these systems are tightly trained around a single objective, and that objective in the examples you gave, Cass, could be flight risk or diagnosis of a particular medical condition. And when you define the problem that narrowly, then you can get really good performance. But kind of, as you suggested, like we may not care about flight risk per se, we may care about crime or other objectives as well. And so it could be that tightly maximizing that one objective leads to issues on these others. This has come up in for example, YouTube has gotten a lot of bad press where their algorithms were shown to be prioritizing engagement, which sounds good, that generates revenue from ads. But it turns out some of the most engaging videos are conspiracy theories and fake news. And so there's these examples of the algorithm kind of bubbling up these things. And so in some sense, these algorithms don't generate noise in that they will replicate the same decision each time, but they may not be maximizing the objective we care about. And when you actually sit down to think about what is a good decision or what are the objectives we care about, I think that's the key question. And I'm guessing like that's a rich debate that I think we're going to have more and more as a society as we actually start encoding these decisions. And I think you're right. Like if we had human decisions, we were a bit vague about what those objectives were, and there was a lot of noise around them. But as we start encoding these, we're going to have to really articulate what those are.
That's great. Let me say a little bit about this. So I think we have clarity, at least working clarity, that when we have agreement and specificity on the end, we can tell whether algorithms outperform human beings, and we can tell what we're losing with algorithms. And what we're losing may offend rights. And that's why a Bill of Rights to regulate artificial intelligence is essential. Okay, so that's the case of clarity with what our ends are. I want to give an example which suggests the complexity of cases where we don't have clarity with what our ends are and the seriousness of the problem of noise even there. So I work with an organization, and Danny Kahneman kind of has the lead with the book we're now doing. And this is the motivating story. It's a large insurance company, and they set premiums in the company. Now take this as a case that isn't the most fascinating, but take this as a case where the premium setting, the economic stakes are very large. And it turned out that the underwriter chosen to set the premium for insurance is very noisy, in the sense that the disparity among underwriters in the firm is crazy noisy, and the firm didn't know that. The highest people in the firm expected 10% on a measure of noise variability. It's actually about 5 times that, which is costing the firm hundreds of millions of dollars annually, meaning that's the estimate they give. Now, this is a case where figuring out what the right premium is, it's not like, is someone going to flee or is someone going to get heart disease? So even in cases where we're not clear on the maximand, the existence of noise is unfair and really costly, and artificial intelligence is very helpful. It takes the noise away. Intuition is not, so bias has charisma in behavioral science. And if machine learning takes, or an algorithm takes away, any form of AI takes away bias, there's a round of applause and a smile. If noise doesn't have charisma, it's kind of the invisible killer. But it's a rights violation in the criminal justice system, in the welfare system, in the educational system. Noise as defined, that is unwanted and unjustified variability, not as individualized treatment. It's a rights violation. And artificial intelligence addresses the violation. It may give rise to independent violations or to a kind of myopic, your point, focus on one characteristic of a situation, which is rightly conceived in terms of 12. And that's very important to get clarity on.
May I pass along 2 questions from the audience? So, but maybe we want to pick up on that, on this point a little bit more later. So maybe before Anna leaves, if she's still here, she will have to leave early today, unfortunately. I have one question by Quatrinada Saleh. It's a bit more general. How would you like to see AI be inserted in applications and policies in the response to human rights violations and noise? So maybe Cass, because because you were just talking about noise, but I think human rights violations.
Okay, so I think Anna in particular, but the others too, are focused on rights against artificial intelligence insofar as it violates something we hold dear, which may be individualized treatment, or Daniel's point, identifying the right maximand. And that is very important. If we have unequal treatment in the sense that 2 people are unknowingly in a Kafkaesque encounter with public officials, it might be a bureaucracy in North America or in Europe, and because noise is invisible, it won't be seen. They just will be disappointed, not knowing that someone else is thrilled, who's just like them. So there are various ways to attack noise. There are things that can be done by aggregating decisions, by delaying intuitions, that can do the work that an algorithm is amazing at. But to see that form of unequal treatment as a rights violation, I think is extremely important, not only in cases in which the unequal treatment is the result of consideration of an illicit factor like race or sex, but also in cases in which it's a result of a lottery in which one was subjected to noise, not because your skin color wasn't right, but because you happened to come in Tuesday morning and draw this person rather than that person, or because this person was in a bad mood because their football team lost. We know that when the football team loses the night before, judges are less likely to show leniency to people. Algorithms aren't like that.
So Joanna wants to reply to that, I think.
Abuse coming up too. Oh, sorry. Did you turn me off? Yeah, sorry. What I was saying was the football game slightly threw me because the main correlate is actually domestic abuse that we hear about in the UK, at least. I assume it's the same in Germany. I haven't lived here as long. Anyway, I was wondering, first of all, I'm not worried about AI only assaulting rights. Like I said in the first place, AI is never the actor. So my big concern is about what is the best way that we can defend our rights. And in some countries, in some places, in some classes, in some income zones or whatever, maybe you'll have more rights and other people have fewer. Right. And so what we're doing is we're taking a big system that was sort of hacky for a variety of reasons, and we can hopefully make it better. But I'm worried that if you promise that it's always better, that it's always magically better with a single algorithm that will find the single best algorithm and then we'll apply it across the whole world. First of all, there's a whole lot of impossibility theorems showing that you cannot find one single algorithm that meets all the things that you would want in terms of fairness. For example, you cannot have, as you mentioned, of course, that you cannot have necessarily both fairness of outcomes and also fairness of opportunity. So that, and there's similar things for voting systems or whatever. So what we've seen is that, and there's just some things aren't computationally tractable. So there's good reasons for why we have a variety of different laws and things across the world. So I agree, of course I agree that when we can find ways to reduce corruption and to improve the overall outcomes, and we're doing that with AI now, and we will continue doing that with AI, right? I totally agree that we can get into sweet spots there, but I just get slightly afraid because when I hear, like I've heard, only in America actually, I've heard American generals say you cannot trust people, they're noisy and they're unreliable, and you don't want to have soldiers looking at things, you want AI looking at things. And what I think then is, what are you trying to hide so that nobody sees it? I think that's the assault on whistleblowing. So I worry, I worry about putting together a good enough governance structure and enough transparency that we can be sure that the technology is being used in a good way. Let me give you a very clear local Corona example. So, in the UK, we've been very worried about decentralizing the databases for the track and trace. But in France, we put everything into one database. Well, why? Well, it turns out France had already set up a ministry of the digital, and it already had its cyber-secured, top of the global standard database that they trusted more than they trusted Apple and Google. Now, most countries, probably Apple and Google is more trustworthy than their government, but in France, they're convinced that their own database, having their own database, is a better matter of national security. Like every country will have different trade-offs like that. So I don't know if I've made that clear at all, but let me say my question. My question is, why are you calling for a Bill of Rights? It seems to me that we already have the UN Charter of Human Rights. That's good enough. And what we need is maybe some constitutional amendments in America, but I don't see why we would call it a Bill of Rights. I think we know what our rights are, and what we need is just to say, what are the laws and how do they change given that we have these new affordances?
Okay, the reason for it is that algorithms and artificial intelligence and machine learning either raise novel problems or they require rethinking of old and new specifications of old ideas. So if we have a threat to privacy, one might be concerned that there's a technology that allows for things like this that sweeps up your web browsing. I mean, suppose.
I was very concerned about that earlier.
So the audience may not know that, and I didn't want to mention that, but if you're willing, you were concerned about that. And that's not something to which the Universal Declaration of Human Rights speaks with particularity, nor is it something to which the German or US Constitution speaks with particularity.
Well, what about freedom of thought? I mean, most of the stuff on this is about freedom of thought. So do you have a right to think things?
Okay, now this is my field, kind of. I'm a constitutional lawyer. So what freedom of thought entails with respect to uses of artificial intelligence to sweep up people's data is completely indeterminate. So people have different understandings of what freedom of thought means for that. And so the question for cultures, nations of all kinds, is what specification of freedom of thought has what entailment for uses of artificial intelligence. There are hard questions about discrimination also. So suppose there's a right? Like in the South African Constitution, the very robust right to freedom from discrimination. What does that entail with the use of an accurate algorithm, let's say, that knows that women are more interested in certain products than men, so they get advertisements for that? Now, that may seem relatively innocuous, but what if it involves jobs or opportunities where the accurate fact is that people of color are more likely to apply for or get certain jobs than white people, or that there's a sex disparity? So the existing right protections don't speak with clarity to that. They're incompletely specified. So, the principal thrust of my remarks is very pro artificial intelligence as in its rights protecting form. And that builds on data involving healthcare, where you can find that algorithms can, if designed properly, help protect African Americans against terrible things, and there are analogs in every country. But we don't have, alas, a kind of off-the-shelf Bill of Rights that can be applied to artificial intelligence any more than we have an off-the-shelf set of Bill of Rights that can be applied to food consumption.
Let me throw in a question from the audience that kind of connects to this, and I have another one on human algorithm interaction, which I think we could broaden up a little bit after this. But the first one is by Jens Prüfer to Cas mostly, but I think all of you could say something. You're right that ML algorithms can reduce noise, but due to economies of scale and data, it is likely that after a while there will be very few players who supply the very best algorithms. So you do reduce noise the best as those players. But that leads to high power of those few players, and hence there's a trade-off, which you didn't mention. More algorithmic decision-making leads to less noise, but it increases the risk for abuse via the objectives by the algorithm. So for the risk diversification reasons, we may want to keep some degree of human decision-making.
Okay, so I'm pondering the factual predicate, and which might well be right, but I'm just pondering it. So and I don't know, maybe one of the other panelists does, is there one algorithm for air travel? In other words, there one player who dominates? Is there one algorithm for for heart disease that dominates, that's owned by one person? Maybe Joanna actually knows the answer to this question. I think there are two possibilities. This is the law professor's reaction, which is going to be really simple. The answer is either yes or no. If the answer is no, we don't have to worry. If the answer is yes, we have a natural monopoly and it needs to be regulated accordingly. And there, to Joanna's point, there we do have tools. Antitrust law knows what to do, and natural monopoly regulation knows what to do.
Joanna, did you want to react to that, or shall we continue to the next?
Not much. I just happen to know the guys who had the pricing algorithm for all the airlines, but they got bought by Google anyway. So
yeah, I think that there are sufficient examples where we can observe this. I don't want to say firm names now, but they are starting antitrust actions in this direction, right? But
this is a really huge concern, and so I will go back to the question a little bit. Even what market domination looks like, we're getting pushback. So I'm now actually in a project with the DG competition in the European Commission. They're getting so much pushback. And again, this comes back to that PowerPoint. So when you have such high inequality as you have now, then individual actors or small numbers of actors can start influencing even huge institutions like the European Commission, and start making it harder and harder for the people that are in charge of handling competition to do their job. And I think the last time we got to this level of inequality, we wound up with a couple of world wars and a financial crash. And then we did this Bretton Woods thing where enough of the elite said, you know, what is the point of having a lot of money if anything can happen, like if it's total chaos and destruction? So I think what I'm hoping is that we can get to that point without 2 world wars. We already have had another financial crash. But that it doesn't take too much more trauma for people to realize that we do need to get a little bit, even the boats up a little bit.
and I guess I'll jump on that as well. I think I would say this is not just a problem of humans making decisions versus computers making decisions. And if you think about these kind of three phases that I outlined, like there's this third phase and maybe the second phase as well, where you really can't have humans making these decisions. It's either not possible or not cost effective. So I think the current decision, like the machine learning decisions that we have are quite brittle. And I think they fail in certain ways. And I think there could be a concern that we have a monoculture. If you had, I mean, so typically the most successful algorithms are ensembles, which combine many different algorithms together. But still, if you had one ensemble that was really making all of the decisions, it could have weaknesses. And I've done some work trying to make those more robust. But I do think it's a question of how distributed do we want decision making, even in absence of people. And I think the question of market power is also something that we need to wrestle with. Again, both seeing the trajectory of where things are going, but also envisioning, like, where is this going to land?
I would super love to come back to the thing that you said before about what you thought the end game was here. One of the end games, just speaking to what we're just talking about right now, that I could see is that there would be, if you got a really good regulatory system in and everything was balanced and people were actually doing sustainable stuff and continuing to explore, then for quite a lot of people, it might not be that different from how it is now or has been for the last 100 years or whatever, I don't know. But what I worry about is the other end, that if you have higher communication, that basically everybody is focused into tighter packages, and that wouldn't be as healthy. So I was wondering where you thought that when you're talking about end games, what you were thinking about.
Sure. Yeah. So to be clear, I think you mentioned artificial general intelligence, and that's not what I have in mind. It's just kind of a proliferation of kind of pushing the types of these systems out further and into domains where we aren't currently making judgments or making decisions at scale. And I haven't thought about the implications for inequality as much, but I mean, I think you're seeing, so in digital credit, for example, there, on the one hand, you're seeing people who were ineligible for formal loans before who suddenly have access to that. At the same time, there's concerns that echo concerns in the US around payday lending, that perhaps some people are being led into debt traps. And what's interesting here is that not only are governments, and so I work primarily in sub-Saharan Africa, and so governments are thinking about what regulations to do, but also Google has implemented some regulations in the Play Store around what loans can be offered. And so if you had a previous model where the government had certain regulatory powers and there were certain, so that's one kind of example where you have a regulatory power that wasn't a government that's now shifting to a tech firm. There's also places where we felt like we needed regulation, for example, the taxi cab industry, to ensure quality, where now other ride-hailing services seem to be quite stable and have high quality, to the point where, like, if you landed in Nairobi 15 years ago, you had to have a trusted driver, and like, as an expatriate, you would often hire a driver, and now, like, you hit a button on your phone, and then 3 minutes later, you hop into a stranger's car in a city that has historically been quite unsafe. And so I think you're going to see a shift in what regulations we need. There may be some capacities of government that are no longer necessary. But we need to be able to inspect these systems in new ways. We need to be able to debate what is the good, what is the objective function that we want to optimize. And so I see a pretty profound shift. And also, if it is Google and Apple and Microsoft making these decisions, then that spans across countries. And how do we think about allowing voice and diversity in contexts that are different? I think, like, it raises a whole bunch of questions about the structure of governance.
So, Cass, did you want to reply to any?
Well, I'm thinking that a lot of progress could be made by being really concrete about specific issues to which the abstractions apply. So when we think of the use of artificial intelligence, are we thinking about radiology, where radiologists are actually very noisy? It's crazy that they should be noisy, but they're very noisy. They don't agree with each other often, and sometimes they don't agree with themselves. That is, a radiologist will say on Monday night, yes, and a radiologist will say on Tuesday morning, no. So there's within person and interpersonal noise. So with the radiology, the use of a good algorithm, there's people who have expertise on algorithm and radiology. This may be a few years off, would be all to the good, I think. If we're talking about the criminal justice system with respect to sentencing, we know that rules can discipline bias and noise, but they can produce problems if they're not good rules. So are there algorithms that could do better? With respect to landing planes, the algorithms seem awfully good offhand. The possibility for human override also seems like a good thing. So I'm kind of discussing crudely 3 examples. With Daniel's point about bail and flight risk, what we care about is essential to get clarity on, and their uses of artificial intelligence are positive because they allow unprecedented transparency about the various ingredients and how to trade them off.
Daniel, did you want to say anything on the transparency part? Otherwise, I'd maybe throw in the second question and we'd move on a little.
Sure, I'll say a couple of things. I think, Cass, one of the points that you're making is that historically we haven't had to really be explicit about the decisions that we're making and the values that we have. And now we have to encode these into these decision-making machines. And that means that we can now look at them and say, like, if we have a trade-off between noise and different values, and if we are very clear on the objective, we want the plane to land safely, we don't want like too much acceleration, etc. If we can clearly specify those things, then we can make good decisions. And so I think partly there's kind of 2 things that's happening in this debate, and one is humans versus machines, or like what's happening with machines, and one is just what are our values. And I think it's important to realize that that's not really about the machines, that's about the process of encoding these decision rules. And I think that gives us a kind of a good opportunity to really inspect those. And I think as a society we're gonna have to debate that more. I guess maybe I can loop back to transparency later. It sounded like you had another question.
So I would broaden this a little bit now with a question from the audience, and I think it does broaden this discussion. So right now we've kind of talked about either human decision or algorithmic decision, but what about human algorithm interaction? So there's some research that the design of the algorithm affects decision making if humans are in the loop. So the question is so about essentially then literacy on probabilities and accountability. So in sensitive decisions that judges and doctors make, I don't see them being truly automated without any human oversight. So that resonates, I think, a bit with what Anna said. And because we need humans accountable, responsible in such situations. And then, so one could say that the algorithm could assist the human in such decisions, but how would the responsible human deal with this? So essentially what values are encoded in the human? And in case of uncertainty, would the human follow the algorithm's recommendation, even though the human doesn't necessarily understand the information of the decision? And so is data literacy the answer? What if the human would take a different decision no matter what the algorithm's recommendation, but the human would risk being even more wrong because of this additional piece of information? So if you agree, I mean, maybe we could discuss this a little bit. And
yeah, I can take that. So we have data suggesting that, preliminary data, suggesting that people are much more comfortable with the use of algorithms if there's human override. So I have a dog who is not comfortable. My dog is barking, does not like that judgment. And I am going to offer some support for my barking dog, which is that where the support is that there's also data suggesting that when human override is allowed, at least in the case there's a correct answer, we get more bias and more noise. So the human intuition, which is have algorithms on tap but not on top, can in certain contexts sacrifice the accuracy that algorithms introduce. So that's a problem. There must be contexts where Anna's point about, and Daniel's point about values argue in favor of allowing human override, because the algorithm doesn't take account of something that it's legitimate to take account, or because the individual is able to invoke some point which the society deserves to hear. And I'm going to attend to my dogs a little bit. This is, an algorithm could not predict a dog intervention, but I promise I'll be back quickly.
Would one of the other two like to pick up on that? It was a bit general.
Yeah, I would, I'm sorry to say this, and Cass isn't here right now, but maybe he can still listen. I keep being like halfway between really agreeing and then really slightly worrying about, like, when you say the algorithm is better, it's like there isn't just one algorithm. A lot of people are going to be trying to sell a lot of different algorithms with different goals and pieces behind them. But I still think there is this very interesting conversation to be had, which we will have to have, about, as I mentioned, for example, radiologists are using AI tools all the time, and now, you know, contemporary radiologists, and it is helping them do a better job. And you could say, well, but the AI by itself would absolutely do the better, totally better. Well, maybe on some training set or whatever, but don't forget that one of the things the radiologists is accountable. So that's how we've organized our society. And so you have to ask the question about, at what point do you think it's better to have someone there? And I don't buy that we're going to have great doctors that will just translate the machine's prognosis to us. I think that the doctors will only be engaged if they do feel some agency in these decisions. So I think, and maybe this again, I'm still trying to guess what Daniel was talking about a little bit with the end game part, or maybe that's what we're talking about. We don't know where we're going with that. But I think there's a transition that happens, and that's in a rich society, say Scandinavia. But on the other hand, and there's other societies where you're skipping over. There's communities that never ever had a doctor, and then all of a sudden they get this robot surgeon, which may not be the best use of the money, but it's the only surgeon available. But there's other kinds of, you know, question answering or whatever that may somehow help people that would never have normally been a doctor. And then they may become the fall person. So there's this concept of moral crumple zone. You don't just want a person there to be the one who gets taken out back and shot the one time out of 3,000 that the algorithm gets the answer wrong or whatever. But I do think we need, and I've heard some really interesting conversations, again, in Finland, that it's in their constitution that there has to be a person at certain points, and they're deciding where they can and cannot use AI, not on the basis of human dignity, although I love those arguments, but on the basis of where in the Constitution there was somebody that was accountable. And so they have to make sure that that accountable person has enough power that it's sensible for them to be accountable. And so we would have to really carefully think about if we're going to reframe those institutions entirely. But back to what Cass was saying, yeah, absolutely, we can massively improve the doctors. And my only concern is, and this is one of the concerns that the airlines used to have too, if the autopilot gets too good, how do you keep the pilots awake? You know, or well, besides cocaine, right? but how do you keep them attending to the problem, right? And you know, those are the kinds of struggles we're going to be having. Maybe it'll be different people that are great doctors if the job is easier, or the parts of the job are different. But yeah.
And I'll jump in as well. I think there isn't really a question of not having humans in the loop, in the sense that if you, I mean, even in deciding what objective to set up and how to set up the decision problem, kind of in a textbook sense, but also if you look at the implementations of these algorithms, like the content ranking at Facebook, for example, they're just layers and layers of responses to what are perceived as problems in that. And so there are human teams, whether the algorithm explicitly asks a human to provide input at a specific spot, or whether the algorithm itself has been evolved to deal with these. I think I mean, I guess one common pattern that we've seen in the development of this is that researchers will find out a flaw in an algorithm, like I think Anna had mentioned this Amazon hiring practice that decided not to look at women as closely as men applicants, or other, I mentioned the YouTube kind of PR scandal. And so often these decisions of where to correct these wrongs is very targeted at these kind of scandals. And that may mean that there may be other problems that aren't quite scandal level, or we haven't found them yet. And so those are being unaddressed. And it may be that those particular scandals have gotten overweighted and there's too much attention. And so I think there is an issue with how, and I think this also comes back to values. I mean, there may be two reasons why you might want a human in the loop. One is because that aids with interactions with humans in these systems. But another is because we think that there's some values that may be missing in that algorithm. And I think if we want to move to a societal process that incorporates those values more holistically, I think we have to think a bit more in a bigger frame about how we incorporate that. So for example, I've mentioned this notion of objectives, but I have some work looking at how you can maximize multiple objectives. So how can you, if we decide that a firm needs to make some profit to keep the doors open, but if we think that they need to weigh that against some impact on social welfare, or if a government, for example, wants to weigh multiple objectives like that, then this raises, again, these values questions, and you have to explicitly state these. But it also offers this opportunity for humans to be in the loop. And you can imagine this dialogue between society and implementers, where you say, no, we think you're measuring the wrong notion of welfare, or we think you need to put more weight on social well-being or health rather than profit or some other objective.
Great. Let me just collect. So I'm not sure if this connects to this. So against proof, I had a follow-up to the previous discussion, but I think this links to what we were just mentioning. So to Daniel, you were mentioning that the important point is that the optimal governance should be case by case. So in the sense that there's no general question, should private firms or public governments have control over technology or the algorithm? And instead, so one would need to review every industry application and will come to very heterogeneous results. For example, taxi services are better privately provided. So I guess this is a bit to the question then how, and so there's, this works well with the additional question. So what do you think, how can society ensure or participate to decide which algorithms accord to societal values or not? So is this, do we need a new regulator? Do we need so do you have thoughts on this?
I don't have super great thoughts. I mean, I think these are exactly the discussions that we need to be having. I think the cases are helpful, and I think Cass has mentioned this as well. It's come very clear in his points of, like, there are specific instances where we can say, like, unfettered application of machine intelligence in this context seems to be really beneficial for society. And there are other contexts where it may be more ambiguous or it may be concerned. So I think it's often very helpful to reason around the cases. I would caution, I don't think the solution is to have 1,000 different regimes, but I think we're kind of seeing these cases and maybe we can start to draw contours around them and then figure out how this should take shape. I don't know. I mean, I think it's still early days for thinking about how to encode these values. We are doing a couple of projects, but they're still quite theoretical in nature, and it's not clear in the end how precisely or how accurately we'll be able to measure the notions of welfare that we think are important, and how much human intervention, kind of thinking beyond the data that we can see, will be required as well. So it feels like a non-answer, but.
Can I come in on that a little bit?
Yes.
Again, ramping off of each other a little bit, but sorry, I'm slightly distracted about that now. It's okay. Well, first of all, going back to the beginning of the question, the European Union has said that every nation of Europe needs to have some kind of regulatory body. So they are anticipating that there's certain kinds of things that they're going to need it to do. Now, at least in the UK discussions, we came to the conclusion that we didn't need that much new law, because if we treat software like a manufactured output, then a lot of the obligations for what you do with how you're supposed to be able to demonstrate that you've provided due diligence and that the system was safe and secure and all these other things is already there. But what you do need is you need the expertise to be able to go through and check that the correct processes were followed. So creating that kind of and hiring up into that has been something that everybody in Europe is supposed to be doing now. But I just wanted to say I was really fascinated by this idea that in sub-Saharan Africa, Google is the one, again, that you can call it self-regulation, but in this case, it's also just trying to keep itself out of trouble, right? But to have that actually in the App Store determining whether there's an overly exploitive debt app, that's fascinating to me. I hadn't heard about that before.
Okay. I was looking at a further incoming question. They're all long questions. I'm sorry about that. It's not me who's making them longer than they are. It's going back a little bit to the point of scandals, so the attention to scandals. So it's by Sebastian Dengler and Tilburg. I think it seems to me that in many situations, the point why this is happening is due to the long-standing biased outcomes of human decisions, and how hard it has been to change human behavior compared to how easily it would be to change what the algorithm outputs. So maybe that's what what's the excitement about, that things happen so dynamically with algorithms as opposed to, I guess, long-standing biases and tools.
Okay, so there's a lot there. I can just
yeah.
Get the tip of the iceberg there. So there is something called algorithm aversion, which is based to some extent on legitimate concerns about individuation and inadequate inputs, but it outruns its legitimate justifications. I think there's an echo in the human mind of something involving 1950s or 1960s science fiction or horror movies, and that the algorithm aversion outruns the legitimate justifications for concern. So that's a general point. On the scandals, sometimes what they're based on is not artificial intelligence as such, and maybe probably always this. It's Joanna's point, what are the inputs, or what are the human designers doing? So to make it more poignant maybe, or alarming, if you have a algorithm that looks at credit ratings or arrest records, if credit ratings or arrest records themselves have bias in them, then building on them will produce bias. And it's not that algorithms are as such are biased, they can excise race or gender as such from their decision making. It's that some input is infected by or correlated by those things. And to Daniel's point, then there's a nice question about transparency. We can trade off maybe if we blind ourselves to something that A, has the virtue of being relevant to something, but B, is infected by bias. What do we do with it? Maybe nothing. Maybe we use it but downgrade it in some way, and that's how the algorithm is trained. But the concern that I think we all should have is sometimes machine learning or artificial intelligence is discredited by a scandal in a way that outruns the dailiness of scandals that never make the media, in which human beings who have a lot of power are doing something at least as bad as what the algorithm did.
Yeah, if you want to add to that.
Well, I just want to chip in one. The famous Microsoft Tay thing that everybody thinks they understand about how Tay learned to be racist and sexist is actually quite like the YouTube thing. So the exact same algorithm was working in China and is still running in the Far East. Because there, if you said something socially unacceptable, everybody shunned you. But in America, if you say something socially unacceptable, then people mob you. We attack people that say the wrong things. And so the consequence was that all these algorithms that were looking for engagement work totally differently depending on the culture. So it isn't only the difference in the algorithm, it is or the programmers. It can also be the people who are using it.
So I have a somewhat general question. I'm not sure how far we can get with that, but so how, what could society or government or regulators do to decrease algorithm aversion or increase trust in algorithms? Joanna, you were.
I'm just laughing because usually I'm going the other way. There's also, it's true, but there's also another thing where people tend to believe computers are right. So they think computers are right, eternal, and perfect. And like if you put a robot out there that tells them like to where the fire exit is, and you have smoke, they ignore signs on the wall. They go where the robot says. And you know, there are certain kinds of cases where they trust the AI too much. I actually was one of the people that did some of that early 2016 research on absorbing bias from just ordinary language on the web, which it turns out people have. So you could get implicit bias, the same biases that we have implicitly, just by reading what we say. What a surprise! Anyway, so the thing was, people just couldn't believe it. They couldn't believe that computers could be sexist and racist, even though they believed each other were sexist and racist. So I usually spend most of my time trying to convince people that you know, that AI is a part of our culture and is no better than we are, except to the extent that we spend extra time on it. And I think that would answer one of the earlier questions you asked too. That if you're going to switch over from using human judges or something to using AI judges, you can't just be marginally better. You've got to be way better. And the reason is because you're writing it down, you're making a big change. And you're responsible for it. You're liable for it. It's explicit what you're going to do. The code is there to be read, and so so that when I'm trying to explain this to people, the best metaphor I've come up with is adoption. You know, we hold adopted parents to a much higher standard than we hold, you know, biological parents, which we don't really have a way to hold them to much of a standard at all, right? Except if something that happens bad with an outcome to their child. But anyway, the point is that the reason is because of the intervention of the state. Suddenly, a lot more people are responsible. And so when you code something, you really, if you're going to shift from a human being responsible to really the corporation or whoever owns the AI or whoever, those people being responsible, of course, you're going to have this really large jump in performance before you would do that.
There's actually data on the specific question, which is how do you reduce algorithm aversion? And if you explain how the algorithm works, then aversion is lower, especially if the algorithm involves aggregation of individual judgments. Then you tell people that's why it works. It's aggregating individual judgments. And then people trust the algorithm better.
So there's another, so Dirk Engelman raised the hypothesis here that maybe algorithm aversion is due to the fact that, or the perception that one cannot argue with the algorithm. So you cannot, and that relates to noise maybe too. So you cannot bring up some special circumstances that might not have been known by the algorithm, which you might be able to do with a judge.
I don't think there's, to my knowledge, there isn't data supporting that hypothesis, but it's a very reasonable hypothesis in some contexts. And it may be then algorithm aversion is justified. Maybe not, depending on error rates.
Yeah.
If it turns out that you get your individual argument and then you're in a Kafkaesque world where people who are articulate get help and people who aren't don't, and then the fact that you could make an individualized argument isn't that impressive. On the other hand, if it results in greater accuracy, then by all means allow human override.
Okay. Was a very nice turn. So we have around 20 minutes. So I mean, so there's a very general question. I'm not really sure we want to go into that. Did any of the three of you have thoughts that you wanted to mention right now about the last couple of questions? Otherwise, we could briefly think about this new question. Okay, so do you think, and so Anna should be here for this, do you think that AI made in Europe is a promising and realistic goal? So this is, yeah, Joanna might want to say, yeah.
That is such a big can of worms. Of course, a lot of AI that is owned by Google now is written by people who grew up and were educated in Europe or China for part of their educations. A lot of people go and do their PhDs in America, you know, but the thing is that right now, again, because of these incredible distortions, at a certain stage, people get this idea, let's go to California and make a lot of money, right? So I do think that there's, I mentioned before this thing about France having their own data centers that they say these are secure data centers, and we're convinced that nobody else is looking at our citizens' data when stuff is here. That kind of stuff I understand. It's of course the computation. One of the things I really worry about is that we don't have the computational power. So while people were distracted at first, I mean, 10 years ago, people were like, oh, Google has all the algorithms, it's so unfair. And then they just open sourced all their algorithms, and people, not all, but quite a lot. And people are like, what are they doing? Oh, it's because they have the data. They're evil because they're holding on to the data. And that's why they're giving away the algorithms to undermine competition that might emerge. It's like, well, yeah, maybe, but so much of AI is computation. It's massive data storage, and it's massive. Google has their own fiber optic network circling the entire globe. When they figured out, because of Snowden, that their own government was hacking them, now they encrypt inside as well as outside. You know, phenomenal cybersecurity everywhere, right? We don't have any, as far as I understand, we don't even have a way to build chips in the EU. I mean, maybe a few little things, but not to scale chip fabrication. So the issues that we have, I think, here are actually more about cybersecurity, compute farms as alternatives to Amazon and Microsoft. I mean, I like Microsoft's trying hard. They're becoming more ethical than they used to, but they still, is openly like anything that Microsoft has, the U.S. government can see. And they're pretty open about that. So so yes and no is the answer. we have the talent, and actually the vast majority, if you don't look at those things like, oh, the top 200 tech companies, every company is using digital now. There's immense digital and including AI capacity that's making our economy, the EU's economy, is the largest economy. It's larger than the US or China right now, if you take the EU as an aggregate. So it's not, there's nothing, of course we've got tons of AI already, but there's certain kinds of components and resources that we're still relying on very heavily to these to companies that are claiming to sit in other countries, but are actually transnational. So one of the things I suggested in the white paper was, well, you could have these companies disaggregate and set up European versions because they know how to build all this infrastructure. But I don't know if we can convince them to do that.
I think if I may say,
because like, the American government would be really annoyed.
I mean, one way to make progress on this, if I may say, is to say, if there's a suggestion there should be AI made in Europe, what goals would that promote, to the point that Daniel is raising? And offhand, one is economic growth, and the other is distinctly European values. And then the question would be, in what way is AI made in Europe tightly connected with either of those goals? It's not clear. There can be AI made in South America that is used in Europe only consistently with European values, or there could be AI made in Europe that is used all over the world consistently with non-European values. And it's just not clear that AI made in Europe would be a boon to the European economy compared to AI made in California. Maybe.
I think one of the things that we're seeing in a lot of these applications is that a lot of the innovation in AI is happening in the public domain, and so I think the question then is whether, like, it's not clear what parts you would want within your national boundaries and what parts are outside. So I would say I agree with Cass's questions on this.
Okay, I have a question myself too, but I don't want to. I don't want to get off track. Yeah, so there's one question here. So continuing this general setting, what if the EU focuses on ethics? So ethical AI, like similar to how the EU pushed forward with privacy regulation, human rights. Maybe you, I don't know, Cass or you, Joanna, you want to give a brief opinion, but then we'd move along.
I just again, so to some extent, I think this is a false dichotomy. One thing about ethics is it's almost like every means by which we hold our society together. So I don't. But if we just talk about regulation, yeah, I think Europe is in a situation where already it's got some regulatory advantages that we are seeing. Of course, we're still waiting. I don't want to make any big assumptions about what's going to happen with the coronavirus. But you guys must have all seen those graphs about what's happened the EU compared to the United States in terms of what's happened after the initial spike. There's some things we're very good at because we're heavily regulated, because we had to cooperate across so much diversity. But I don't think it's quite as simple as that we can sell ethics. You can't go into other countries and say, oh, you guys don't have ethics, we do. How colonial is that? I think it is more about selling stability. In fact, I saw somebody, the person that was the European partner in charge of the European African coordination in a presentation in Brussels in a policy thing, say, look, if you need something fast, if you're in Africa and your country has a real problem, go to China. The EU is not fast. But if you have a big problem that you want solved stably, that you cannot worry about the solution once you've made it, it's just going to last, come to us, because we're good at long, stable solutions. And why it's going to be stable is because we're going to take not only you and us into account, but your people. And your people are going to benefit too. We are good at coming up with these win-win solutions, and it's not zero-sum games with us. So I think it's interesting that EU now thinks that's their brand, or at least that's what they're saying in the African context, but I think it should be our brand. So
will you allow my question then? And I don't know, maybe that'll be the final, but to the audience, please keep questions coming. Maybe we will be able to do it. So I would like to go back to the so seeing algorithms more like a technology that is developed by accountable firms or individuals, and that can be used by firms or governments. So I'm wondering about how a regulator could certify these, in the sense that very often the output of an algorithm depends on the input which is generated by humans from different backgrounds, countries where regulation might be different. So my personal impression is that so governmental use and firm use needs a lot of evaluation of algorithms to figure out what the consequences are, what is actually what I need to be accountable for. And I'm struggling with seeing a practical way to how to do this, because there's so many challenges that come up in any one specific application. So I'd be interested to hear your
I think I'd go at it a little sideways or something. Let me explain. So under President Obama, I was lucky enough or something to be the nation's chief regulator. That was my job. And if the suggestion was made that there should be a regulatory certification process for algorithms, I think a lot of us would have been very nervous. And the reason is that the category is so extremely large and the harms done is so dependent on what category we're speaking of, that to treat algorithms as a demon or something which we need some regulatory body to control, would probably be algorithm aversion on steroids. So what we probably need is clarity about in what domains algorithms raise special risks to things we care about. Now, we might have, to Joanna's point, here I'm completely going to agree with her, we might have rights that we treasure. It might be a privacy right or a non-discrimination right that would be properly deployed as a check on certain uses of algorithms. But to certify, universities that use algorithms or railroads that use algorithms, it would seem so I notice sometimes in the United States, the word regulation, it's as if it's a satanic word. And sometimes in Europe, the word regulation, it's as if it's an angelic word. And in this context, maybe neither.
So the European Commission white paper has suggested that we do certification now. And I actually was just only minutes ago somehow mysteriously in London on a panel. And there were people there talking about the fact that that for when you have a system, even if you certify locally the micro behavior, when you plug it into the larger system, it can have consequences you wouldn't have anticipated. But they said that's true of banking too, and that banking has both micro and macro regulation. So I think that the idea of the European stuff is that, and also actually the British independently now are talking about, all their accountancy firms are wanting to run out and do assurance for you, because basically the executives are hearing about AI and they don't know what it is and they don't know how to tell if their programmers are doing things right. So I think the point of the certification would be at least to say, you followed all the correct procedures. We understand that you tested the stuff, there's cybersecurity on your data logs or whatever. And it can't prove, it would never be able to prove nothing could possibly go wrong. But it might be that you could at least pre-prove that you followed due diligence, so the extent of your liability might be limited that way. But this stuff isn't finished yet. It is currently the white paper.
Yeah. Daniel, or
yeah, I mean, I think there's so many. Like, I think it would be really hard to ensure that there are no harms from an algorithm, and like unless you are very clear about the specific harms you're looking for in a specific domain, then I don't know if you could make much progress.
So there's one related question to this. Would any of you support or rather oppose to introduce product liability for software or code of an algorithm, I guess?
Well,
that's a yes and no question.
No, absolutely. I've already said that. I think that we should have the same kind of liability if you didn't keep the system cyber secure, if you didn't follow good practice, if you didn't test for example, this thing. As far as I know, there was this thing about Amazon, like in their HR. As far as I know, it was just a program they ran. They didn't actually make hiring decisions on it. But had they not tested to make sure that their hiring program wasn't sexist, because now everybody knows about, you don't want to do induction on your current workforce. Now that would be a liability issue, whereas 20 years ago it wouldn't have been, because people didn't understand that 20 years ago. So I do think that, like I said, like you would with any other manufactured artifact, there's an ongoing development of standards, and the standards can be actually formalized by, for example, professional organizations. And then what the rule of law, the role of the government is just to say, demonstrate to us that you built this to a standard, and that can reduce your liability. So that was what I was just talking about a minute ago, actually.
Okay. So I'm not entirely sure if we answered the question, one other question here, whether it makes sense to regulate AI in general, given that it's so heterogeneous. So we've jumped back and forth around this, and I don't remember if we came to a conclusion.
I would be very cautious about that. So the idea that AI in general needs a regulatory body, it's possible, but the category is so large.
And yeah, just briefly on that, I mean,
Oops, sorry.
No, so like if you define that as decision making, like a lot of, you can encode our current decision making processes as algorithms. Like it's not clear what differentiates an algorithm where a human is involved in a bureaucracy versus something that's been encoded up in software, which you wouldn't call AI, versus like a new generation of decision rule that involves machine learning. It's not really clear what the core differentiator between those is in terms of the regulation you would want.
Well, absolutely, I agree that. So I totally agree. Don't try to regulate AI. Regulate software. I thought I said that earlier at the very beginning, but it's been a long thing. but absolutely, don't get into fights about that. But anyway, I know that the German position on the EU white paper is that that there should be a small horizontal across AI thing, and I don't know what they thought should go into that. But if it was me, it would be the stuff that I just mentioned about logging the design documents and the testing and things like that, the stuff that the humans did. So certain kinds of competence to be able to go and check if software has been written properly and tested properly and cyber secured. But then everything else I think is vertical. It should be, it should be where the expertise is, automotive or whatever, wherever the application was.
So Joanna, can I just one? It's probably going to be the last question, but it might be related to this one. I don't know the initiative, but so regarding standards and certification, what do you think of the IEC Ethically Aligned Design and Practice Initiative? I don't know it, but I was wondering if this is related to what you mentioned, or if any of the panelists.
You mentioned it as an ATAC. You didn't mention it as an IEEE Standardized Design. That document is gigantic, and I was one of the co-chairs on the Affective AI. I don't think only because I was a woman, but anyway, I do have a little bit of research in emotional AI. I think it's a starting point, and it was interesting because people got upset, for example, with Google, if they just arbitrarily by the external world chose 8 people and put it in charge of ethics. So IEEE did the opposite. Anybody could join, and it was such a nightmare trying to pull it all together and make it, and it's now 360 pages of sort of advice. So what is the status of that document? I think it helped people think, and people can read through it and get some intuitions. But IEEE itself and also a bunch of the other professional organizations are trying to come up with more formal standards that you can actually say whether you met it or not. So I think that my favorite parts of that document were actually by the core at the very beginning. I think the core committee, Kay, First Butterfield, I'm so sorry, Alan Winfield, and there was like about 5 people that were on the absolute core. Those core general ones were great. There are some weird things in the corners that you can find if you look hard. But anyway, but what was interesting was the process and getting people into the.
Thank you very much. So we are nearly out of time. I would like to thank all 3 of you, and Anna has already left, very much for taking the time. Do you have any final thoughts that you would like to tell us? Otherwise, I would hand over to Paulina, and I hope this was also entertaining for the attendees.
Yeah, so thank you so much. First of all, to the fantastic panel of speakers, of course, and to Hannes for these very interesting 2 hours. So under the impression of these very lively discussions today and also the many questions we got from the audience, I think it's fair to say that the effort to organize at least a small virtual event instead of our usual annual conference paid off. And of course, none of this would have been possible without the many people involved. Again, a very, very big thank you to all the panelists and to Hannes for moderating the discussion today, but also the local organization team at DLW. So Christiane, Dennis, Kevin, who also tried at the same time to solve all the technical issues we had in the beginning. Let me also note that we recorded this event, so we will also shortly post this video on YouTube in case you want to watch it again. And also let me make one final remark. even though it was very inspiring today and we were very happy to meet you, at least in the virtual space. Of course, we all prefer to meet in person. So we hope that we will see many, if not all of you, at next year's conference in person and live in Berlin. So thank you very much and have a great day.